Welcome, everybody, to our second IOE Rough Cut of the semester. My name is Dan Atwater. I'm the new Associate Director of the IOE. Sarah, where is Sarah right now? She's en route. I think she's in the car right now.
Actually, yeah, she's probably driving.
So she's coming here, but she's not able to make it in time. So I'll be introducing the Rough Cut seminar for today. And I'm very excited that we're going to be able to introduce Maddie Stevens to present her work. So Maddie is a recent arrival in the Department of Earth Sciences. She's an assistant professor who studies human-wildlife coexistence, political ecology, governance, and restoration. She does place-based research that helps us to understand the linkages between humans and environmental systems. And I personally think this is exactly the research that we need to be seeing right now going on in Montana. And I'm grateful that Maddie is here to be doing this research. I'm super excited to hear what she has to present for us. So Maddie is a native to the area, Spring Hill. Okay, I got it.
Where's the
That's up there. It's to the north yonder, on the beautiful slopes of the Bridger Range. Oh, it's there.
Way to start.
Okay, perfect. That's where Maddie's from. Now I'm jealous, but that's okay. And so she got her bachelor's degree at Franklin University in Switzerland in 2015, her PhD from the University of British Columbia in 2022, and then she did a postdoc through Boise State, but while living here, and now she is here for good as an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences. I'm very excited to see what Maddie has to share with us, and let's just please welcome Maddie with a round of applause.
Thanks so much, Dan, and it's nice to see so many friendly, familiar faces. So, hi, I'm really delighted to be here. I'm even more delighted to be here in the department permanently. I'm super excited to be actually based at MSU now. As Dan mentioned, I grew up in Spring Hill, just up here in the Bridgers, and I was one of those kids that was just absolutely in love with wildlife. And so I initially thought maybe I would be a vet or maybe I'd be a wildlife biologist. And then, unlike the last Rough Cut speaker, I quickly determined that math wasn't my thing. So I went a different direction. And I was always very interested also in stories and in people. So that led me down actually a humanities track. So as Dan mentioned, I went to undergrad in Switzerland and I studied comparative literature and cultural studies. So starting off trying to understand how do the stories we tell about our environment, about the land, about one another as humans affect how we interact, affect sort of what happens in the material world. And my first opportunity to get exposed to research was also as an undergrad, where I went to northern Uganda and was studying land rights and land conflict. And that was really eye-opening in that I got the chance to do interviews, to spend time talking to people in the field, and really got excited about what we could learn from very sort of rich place-based research, talking to people from a lot of different perspectives about the environment. And then I left school, went into the wildlife conservation world, back to kind of the love of wildlife, and spent a few years working in polar bear conservation with an organization that's actually based here in Bozeman. And I really loved this work and found it really exciting. But I also was finding that the science that was being included in the work that we were doing was almost exclusively biology and ecology work, which was really rich and meaningful and important, but it wasn't addressing the challenges that seemed to be most pressing, which were social challenges. How do we address climate change? How do we deal with human-wildlife conflict? So that motivated me to go back to grad school. And my PhD work mostly focused on community forest governance in northern India. I won't talk about this much today, but I think there are a lot of really interesting parallels. And one of the things that was most striking to me about the work in India was noticing just how tolerant people are of wildlife, especially compared to here. I think the American West is one of the places that has sort of the largest personal space bubbles of anywhere, both when it comes to other humans and also when it comes to wildlife. So spending time in India was really instructive in thinking about how do you foster tolerance for conflict that can actually be pretty egregious and pretty impactful on people's livelihoods. After my PhD, I really wanted to be able to come home. I was already living back here. I spent the last couple of years of my PhD working remotely. I really wanted to bring my research home to Montana, and I got the opportunity to do a postdoc studying buffalo restoration with partners across the Blackfoot Confederacy. And so that's the work that I'm going to be building on today, and thinking about kind of what does it mean to live with bison as wildlife in Montana and beyond. This has been a really interesting opportunity to do very community engaged research. I'll introduce you to a few of the people who've been involved in that. But this has been sort of the seed for a lot of the work that I'm doing now in my new faculty role. And now I'm here and really interested in thinking broadly about human-environment relationships in Montana, as close to home as Petil, and ideally also much further afield. I've done a lot of work in mountain systems, but I'm also kind of mainly really interested in rural and indigenous landscapes, and how do we coexist with wildlife in those spaces, particularly where in places where we also raise food and spend time out on the land. So this is my brand new research group. I don't have a lab name yet. I am really excited to be just starting to work with a few really neat students. I worked with some Hilliman scholars this program on the bison work. Have a new undergrad. Thank you, Zach, for bringing Morgan into my office the other day. A USP scholar working on Yellowstone bison management questions, and a PhD student, Sophie Wilder, who's working on community health and wildlife restoration. So really excited to be starting to get this research off the ground and building on some of the questions from my postdoc, and hopefully eventually getting back to India too. So there are sort of a few key guiding questions that are the focus of my work. I think about how do people make decisions about wildlife and wild places and the environment in general? How and why do especially rural and indigenous communities engage in environmental stewardship? What are the values and reasons and priorities that factor into those decisions? What underlying conditions or factors support sustainable tolerance for wildlife in shared landscapes? And in particular, this is more kind of a methodological question. What can really rich, specific place-based insights tell us about broader drivers of global environmental change? So trying to think about linking place-based insights with broader systems and evidence. So as mentioned, I do a lot of work in the Northern Rockies and Great Plains with the Montana focus, and then some work in the Indian Himalayas, which I would really like to rekindle, and then interested in other rural and indigenous landscapes as well. In terms of methods, I mostly focus on trying to build strong collaborations with community partners. And this is really motivated by an interest in addressing questions that are of practical use. So I have always found it most interesting and exciting to be working on questions that come from community partners rather than just my own brain. The main reason for that is that people want to talk to you about things that are relevant and pressing and of current importance. And it makes for much better interviews, it makes for much more interesting data, and it makes for research that can actually do something in the world. The majority of this work is field-based. I do a lot of qualitative data collection, primarily with interviews and participant observation, so just really spending time in places. I do a little bit of document and policy analysis to complement that. I think in another version of things, I would have been a historian. I get really excited about historical processes as well, so you'll see some of that coming out. And then, as I mentioned, I try to engage in processes that are focused on evidence synthesis. So monitoring, assessment, this is sort of large scale, trying to bring these insights into conversation with the kind of big reports like the IPCC, things like that. So how do we understand insights across place-based studies as well as at this larger scale? So I'm going to talk today about two projects. Well, really, I'm going to be lumping together insights from two projects. The first is the Indigenous-led Ecological Restoration Project. This is the project I was lucky enough to get to work on as postdoc at Boise State, led by Libby Lundstrom. If you're interested, this is a really cool multimedia report that we put together that has audio. You can listen to the voices of people we interviewed. There are all sorts of different kind of interactive tools on there to share kind of what we learned and what we did in the course of this project. And then that project grew into a few different directions, one of which was my short-lived postdoc here at Montana State that I'm now carrying forward into my faculty role, which is a project on restoring coexistence. So the bigger context for this work, and I'm not going to dwell too much on the bison story because it's probably one that you guys are fairly familiar with, but we've been kind of in a bison moment lately. There's been a ton of attention and interest around restoring herds of free roaming bison. This has particularly been led by tribes all over North America, but particularly in Montana. We have a lot of examples of this taking place right here at home. But it's presenting pretty significant challenges, and that's not surprising because bison are returning to landscapes that have radically changed in their absence. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's so difficult to live with bison and manage bison as wildlife in this world, besides sort of the very, very obvious reasons that show themselves. To give kind of a brief sense of the context and history here, bison conservation has been kind of a success story in many ways. From a low of about 1,000 animals. How many bison are on the continent today? Does anyone know? Ballpark? Not Dave?
100,000.
You count them all, Dave?
Anyone, throw out a number.
50,000.
One
I'm gonna
more
guess.
order of magnitude.
I'm guessing higher,
Pretty much.
100,000.
So about 500,000 almost for 450,000. There's a lot of different estimates out there, but there are a lot of bison. That's a small number when compared to the probably 30 to 60 million that were here as late as about 1800. But it's a pretty significant resurgence from 1,000 animals. The big caveat to this is that the vast majority of these bison are managed as livestock. So about 95% of them. The average herd size, and I just learned this recently, is only 175 animals. So the vast majority of these bison are kept in very small herds. This is very different than than the average cattle operations, which is much larger. They're also bred selectively, as you do with livestock. Their social dynamics are different because they're separated the calves are separated at a younger age. There are all sorts of reasons why these bison don't live the same lives that wild bison do. They also have cattle genes, and the genetics are a whole other conversation we can talk about that is really interesting, but I'll set that aside for now. So as a function of that, they're basically still considered by most ecologists to be functionally or ecologically extinct. This is a great paper that just came out in August by Chris Jeremiah, who's the Yellowstone bison biologist. If you haven't seen this paper, it's really cool. Looking at trying to understand the ecosystem function of free-roaming bison, because we actually, from a scientific standpoint, don't really know that much about how they operate because they were gone quickly, and they don't, even in a place like Yellowstone, they don't necessarily act the way they did. So there are approximately 35,000 or so wild bison in conservation herds that are managed by the federal government of either Canada or the US. And then there are about 30,000 bison in tribal herds. Some of these are super wild, some of these are not. So it really varies. And the whole distinction of wildlife versus not is challenged by many tribal communities who see it as an artificial distinction anyway. So we'll talk about that as well. Even most conservation herds are pretty small. The average is only 300 animals per herd. So not particularly free-ranging. And even in Yellowstone, which is sort of considered the largest and most free-roaming bison herd that we have, it faces significant limitations on movement. As many of us are probably aware, there's not a lot of space for bison to go outside of the park. So why aren't bison managed as wildlife? This is a question that comes up a lot in the research that we've been doing and has some very obvious answers and some much more subtle answers. It's something I get asked a lot as well. And so I thought this would be an interesting opportunity to just try to think harder about why don't we manage bison as wildlife? And what makes them so different from other species that we do manage as wildlife, despite the fact that they live in this landscape that has roads and infrastructure and cows and people and all of that. So Montana is a really interesting place to study this for a few reasons. One of them is because we have the Yellowstone herd, We also have some other pretty big audacious initiatives to restore free roaming bison. One of them is up in the Blackfeet Nation. That's the work that I've been involved in over the last few years. And so a lot of the insights here come from interviews that are from that context. And then American Prairie is another place where a lot of this is trying to happen. So large scale bison restoration efforts are really underway in Montana in a way that they're not in most other states. So the team that I've been working with there's just a bunch of really incredible people. Julia Haggerty was the PI on the postdoc grant that I got here at MSU. Libby Lundstrom, as I mentioned, leads the project at Boise State. And this is our amazing advisory board who I've just been so lucky to get to work with, elders across the Blackfoot Confederacy. And then lots of students. I've really enjoyed working with students on this project, including Zahara and Johnny, who are MSU students in the Hillman Scholars Program. So our process in this project has been to work with our advisors, to define goals and objectives and questions. And then we've had sort of 4 methodological pillars. The core of this has been interviews and dialogues with community members. We've done 72 interviews. This equates to a huge amount of data. We've also done some preliminary geospatial analyses, although this has been pretty stymied by data availability challenges. This is led by Matt Williamson at Boise State, so I won't be talking about it today, but there is a geospatial component of this. And then a lot of going to meetings and gatherings that people are already having to think about and learn about, conversations about bison. And then land-based learning. And I put a question mark there because it's pretty hard to quantify what that looks like, but I've spent, I don't know how many hours, many hours walking around with people on the landscape, talking to people about their priorities and perspectives and opinions on bison, and kind of trying to gain a more immersive sense of what this looks like on the landscape. And then we have been putting together and are still in the process of putting together research outputs, both more public-facing and academic, all of which are co-authored with community partners. So that's been a really cool process of working, especially with our advisory board and other tribal partners, to try to write this work together. That's a whole other part of our ongoing research, is more focused on process, but I'll save that for another day. This is what our work looks like in the field when it's a lot of fun. Really cool opportunities to get out, like I said, and learn on the landscape. And then this is the 95 to 99% of the time of doing this work that is spent digging through the 4,000 pages of data that this project has generated. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with qualitative analysis, this is a coding process that is sort of how we make meaning out of this kind of a bulk of data. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of a few of the challenges or limitations for living with bison. The first and most obvious one that I'll talk about is cattle. This is the sort of top of mind political controversy around bison, has to do with the fact that bison are no longer the dominant herbivore on this continent. Cattle are, in terms of numbers. This starts with really close ecological similarities. So one of the people we interviewed shared this idea that the bison want to be where we are, or more specifically, where our cows are. So this is one of the defining features of this conflict, or the difficulty of having wild bison. They occupy a very similar ecological niche. They are different and they graze differently, and there are lots of interesting differences that have been teased out by scientific work that are known in traditional knowledge. But they do, at a kind of basic level, have a lot of similar needs and occupy a lot of similar roles. They eat the same food. They're contained by the same infrastructure. It's really hard to imagine a wildlife-friendly fence for bison, that contains cows but doesn't contain bison. And then there is a potentially significant disease transmission risk, which is particularly significant in Yellowstone. And so, because they were almost completely eliminated, the whole industry of cattle ranching developed without bison being present. So it wasn't developed to deal with the presence of free-roaming bison. The disease risk question is really interesting and something that you could spend a whole talk digging into. But this is a quote from a Montana State vet that I found really interesting in elucidating why the disease challenge is less of a biological issue than it is a trade or economic issue. About 90 to 95% of the cows that are raised in Montana get shipped out for slaughter, and so they have to cross state lines. Brucellosis is a controlled disease. It's a disease that's endemic in Yellowstone bison that they originally got from cows. It's also endemic in elk in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And so that often raises, we hear a lot from conservationists, this idea that, well, there's never been a recorded case of brucellosis being transmitted from bison to cows, and that's true. But it's true with the caveat that part of the reason for that is because bison have been so aggressively contained. Elk are not aggressively contained in the same way. And I think this quote sheds some light on that in noting that the disease itself it doesn't manifest fundamentally differently in bison and elk and cattle. There's no reason to imagine that it wouldn't be transmittable between bison and cattle. But we manage the risk that we can, was sort of the Department of Livestock perspective on this. Bison are just simply easier to manage. And part of that is infrastructure, but a big piece of that is that there's a significant hunting lobby associated with elk. There is a history of people knowing how to live alongside elk. So you don't have the same political will for containment that still exists for bison. Most, for the last several generations, we haven't lived with bison roaming the landscape, and so that is sort of the normal. If you're familiar with the shifting baseline syndrome, or is it syndrome? Yeah, I guess it is. The baseline, the sort of assumed baseline is elk move across the landscape, bison don't. And so it's very hard to, shift that in really either direction. So the state's approach to managing disease risk has been, there is a risk, it threatens the economic industry, so we can't really manage it in elk other than monitoring it and some containment measures. So we manage bison and we keep them contained to Yellowstone. Another aspect of the similarity between bison and cattle that causes trouble is cultural and social. And this is something that came up in a lot of our interviews with tribal livestock producers. And in a way that I was a bit surprised by or didn't necessarily expect. One of the things that people talked about often was that cattle ranching is a way to have a life on the landscape. And this came up with people who appreciate and care about bison, but were also concerned about the idea of there being free roaming bison because they were concerned about the idea that that would displace a cattle ranching livelihood and a cattle ranching way of life that has become really important culturally on many tribal reservations, certainly off reservations as well. There is a significant heritage and sense of identity and kind of cultural continuance associated with the presence of cows. And interestingly, most of the people who are bringing back bison who are actually like managing restored bison herds are cowboys. Like the American Prairie guys who manage bison are cowboys. In Blackfeet Nation, most of the people who were involved in bringing bison back in the first place were cowboys, which is an interesting connection that I think highlights this similarity and this relatedness between bison and cows. They also occupy kind of a similar food system role, potentially a similar kind of economic keystone role. And so this environmental NGO staff person put it as, it all boils down to grass. It's a finite resource, and there's this fear that taking anything out of production from cattle and transferring it to bison, no matter what land that is, it's taking away the economic opportunity and a way of life, culture, and heritage of that land. And I think this is something that, at least in our research, has shown itself to be true kind of across the board in Montana, whether you're on reservations or not, even though I think there are much more sort of subtle and complicated feelings about bison among tribal nations. And that might be true to some extent, at least outside of that. Okay, so if the first challenge is cows, why are cows a challenge for bison? It's not necessarily because of, or at least it's not only because of the animal itself. it's also because of how we manage them. We manage them in highly fragmented landscapes, fenced landscapes. This is most obvious in an ecological sense, and this is something that I'm sure everyone in the room is very familiar with, that fragmentation is sort of the stake through the heart of, in this case, the grassland ecosystem, but you could probably say this about many different ecosystems. Ecological fragmentation makes it incredibly difficult to sustain movement, to sustain processes and connections across space. And particularly in a grassland ecosystem where bison have operated ecologically at these very, very large scales. And you also have a loss of other key ecological processes: fire, the presence of indigenous hunters on the landscape, other sort of major large scale ecological and not to mention cultural roles have basically don't exist on the grassland ecosystem anymore, or at least only in very small fragments. So the bottom line is this, Alicia Yellow Owl, who's an educator at Blackfeet Community College, suggested, the bottom line is they're not like deer. They're not going to jump the fence. They're just going to plow through it. So we have this big animal that can't be free roaming because it's going to wreak havoc when they rip through everybody's fences. That's the bottom line. The landscape of their once habitat has changed. So there are examples out there, and the Book Cliffs and Henry Mountains herds in Utah are a good example of this, where bison and cattle are in the same landscape. It seems to work reasonably well. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of conflict. They tend to avoid each other. They don't interbreed. There haven't been major disease issues. And which I think it highlights that that fences are a huge part of this. You can't take the kind of bites of grass component out of the equation either, but the fact that our infrastructure limits and contains the movement of large animals, I think, is a big part of this challenge. But beyond ecological considerations, another big aspect of the fragmentation challenge is jurisdictional. So this quote points this out well. Land fragmentation is an issue if people's attitudes or policies on those lands differ. If they're all the same and people can come to agreement, bison can cross my land, no problem. So the fragmentation itself is more of a symptom, with the underlying issue being sort of division among people, division among different priorities. The Yellowstone ecosystem is a really fascinating example of this because, on the one hand, it's one of the most ecologically intact ecosystems we have in the lower 48 for sure, and in kind of the Rockies in general. But it's also highly jurisdictionally fragmented. You have so many different government agencies, entities, private landowners, state, federal, all sorts of different jurisdictions overlapping in this space. And on many issues, they find a way to ensure that ecological connectivity happens, which highlights that jurisdiction can be, in some cases, kind of the more significant component of a fragmented landscape. And this comes from a lot of different places. This kind of friction, so a situation where you have not only fragmentation of jurisdictions, but also sort of a disagreement among priorities. A lot of this really comes from the fact that different agencies have distinct and competing mandates and priorities. The Department of Livestock is not going to have the same goals as the U.S. Forest Service, is not going to have the same goals as the Shoshone-Bannock Nation, for instance. So we have sort of trade-offs and competition among different priorities for the land. And ultimately, this comes down to questions around what is the purpose of public lands and who do they serve? So that gets into the third challenge that I want to highlight, which is politics. This is a major challenge for the possibility of having bison move freely across the landscape. This is a picture from this summer in Wind River Reservation. I know this is outside Montana, but there's been some really amazing work to try to create space for bison as wildlife on Wind River Nation and or on the Wind River Reservation. And Jason Valdez here on the left has been really foundational to that work. And he will talk to you at length about trying to navigate the politics of bison, which is super complicated, both among the tribes of the Wind River Reservation, as well as with the state of Wyoming and federal government. Bison are a really political animal. this has shown itself in a lot of different situations. Most recently, Montana is currently suing Yellowstone National Park over their most recent bison management plan, asserting that they have that the cap that they've set for bison is too high and that they're sort of going back on earlier agreements. And they don't want to see more tolerance for bison outside of the park boundaries. So this is currently in litigation. This bison moment that we've been seeing, the window may be closing. It's been an interesting time. Things have changed a lot between 2022 when I started working on this and now. And the state of Montana in particular has hardened its stance in that period of time on, or at least in the last like 4 or 5 years, on having bison outside the park. But the political symbolism of bison takes on several different sort of characters. On the one hand, they are sort of this national symbol. They're America's national mammal as of 2016. They're also a really powerful symbol of Indigenous resurgence, a really powerful source of hope and political and assertion of political sovereignty as well. So the reestablishment and reintroduction of bison on tribal lands is an exercise of sovereignty. The hunting of bison outside of Yellowstone National Park is an exercise of sovereignty. These are important ways in which bison are a political animal that has been helping to foster Indigenous cultural revitalization and political revitalization. They are also very much interpreted as a symbol of government interference by many people, particularly rural communities, rural non-Indigenous communities in particular. And they tend to get lumped in the same category as grizzlies and wolves here. This is a common feature of reintroduction. Reintroduced species very often become sort of lumped in together with a sort of oppressive and authoritarian, or a vision of an oppressive and authoritarian government that is telling you what to do, taking away your rights, imposing an animal that is causing harm to a livelihood or could potentially cause harm to a livelihood. So in these ways, the controversy around bison is in some ways much less about bison than it is about what they represent to different people. This was another quote that I think expresses that well. With a situation as high profile as Yellowstone, that brings everyone in. You have a high profile issue, you get all sorts of pot stirs and people who have their own issues to try to create divisions that come in and muddy the waters. One interesting thing about this is since at least 2011, there have been there's been sort of a consistent result in polling that suggests that most people in Montana want to see bison managed as wildlife. It hovers between 60 and 80%. But generally speaking, there is broad public acceptance for managing bison as wildlife in Montana. There are distinct exceptions to that in particular places, but interestingly, even in places where people live directly alongside wildlife, adjacent to Yellowstone, for instance, up in Blackfeet country, for instance, there has been over the last 30 years or so a pretty significant shift towards tolerance. And this is something that gets reported by a lot of people who work with bison, that the very local politics of it is a lot less contentious and tense than it used to be. This is something that the undergrad I'm working with is going to be looking at in the interagency bison management plan documents to try to get a sense of the tone of public comment and the tone of conversation over the last 20 years or so. But it's interesting that right in and around Yellowstone, certainly right in and around the region where bison are reintroduced up in Blackfeet country, it just isn't that big a deal. There's been pretty good work done to try to build relationships between wildlife managers and livestock producers and landowners, and that's been relatively successful. In the 70s and 80s, when bison were first reintroduced up in Blackfeet Nation, there was pretty widespread opposition to that among tribal members. It was not popular. If any of you have seen the film Bring Them Home, which you should if you haven't, it's spectacular. They talk about that. This was not easy for people. It was not something people were excited to see. And I think the fact that that has changed so much is pretty significant. It's interesting that that has kind of gone in the opposite direction as the sort of politicization where, well, I think it's gone through waves. In the 90s to early 2000s, bison were super politically controversial. And then there was a period of time where there was actually quite a lot of progress politically in trying to find common ground. And we have since sort of re-entrenched into those political divisions. So legally speaking, I'm gonna try to hurry through this because I want to have time for a discussion. But bison are federally listed as wildlife, and many tribes, including Blackfeet, including the Wind River Reservation, depending on the context, bison in Montana can be considered wildlife or livestock. They're dual listed, and they're also around Yellowstone considered species in need of disease management. In 2021, the Montana legislature made some interesting decisions that redefined, they didn't change the listing of bison as wildlife. So bison are still technically wildlife or livestock in Montana, depending on context. But they effectively redefined wild bison out of existence, particularly through House Bill 318, which defined wild bison as bison that have never been handled nor descended from handled animals. That is all bison. All bison are descended from handled animals. The Yellowstone bison, which was sort of the last remaining wild herd, were rounded up and managed as ranched animals in the Lamar Valley in the early 1900s. So effectively, Montana no longer recognizes the reality of wild bison. This means in Montana, bison are wildlife on federal lands, on tribal lands, but not where they're managed by the state, which includes Forest Service lands. So the jurisdictional complexities there are significant. Okay, so the last kind of key challenge is trust. And I think this underlies really the rest of these, which is there is a long history of discontent among different groups. There is a lot of kind of bad blood that is really difficult to overcome. This quote speaks to the idea that all it takes is sort of one bad interaction to destroy trust. And there is a very, very long history of very fraught relationships when it comes to bison that are also very, very painful for many people. So we're not sort of starting from zero, we're starting from a situation where there is a pretty strong lack of trust, and efforts to try to rebuild that are really important in trying to find some version of space for wild bison. I'm gonna skip this because of time. Well, okay, briefly. A lot of people that we spoke to, a lot of ranchers that we spoke to really emphasized the idea that it was less about the bison and more about the people managing the bison, and more about having a relationship with the people managing the bison, so that the idea that if you don't do your due diligence with your neighbors, you're not going to be able to have positive relationships, you're not going to be able to have coexistence. So a lot of this work is about trying to form good relationships between wildlife management agencies, between agencies themselves. A lot of the good work that happened with the Interagency Bison Management Plan in Yellowstone was because there were people who were sitting in those meetings for years, for over a decade, who got to know each other, who were able to work past some of these differences in mandates to respect the need to work across different perspectives. Okay, so why does it matter if bison are managed as wildlife? Why does this matter beyond sort of an intrinsic valuing of wildlife or some sense of sort of justice? This is a quote from one of the leaders of the ENE initiative that I think really speaks beautifully to the kind of deeper significance of why it matters for wildlife, or for bison to be wildlife. From the beginning, it was like they're wildlife and they belong out there. Why can't they be wildlife just like other animals? And he made a really strong connection between experiences of buffalo and experiences of Indigenous peoples, talking about kind of the parallels between bison management in places like Yellowstone and the Indigenous dispossession from their lands and territories. And so he talked about how significant it is both politically as well as sort of emotionally and culturally and spiritually to be able to have bison be free roaming as a justice goal. And he talked about what a sort of big dream this is. And I think a lot of people who were involved in these efforts 15 years ago didn't think this was ever going to happen. And it's pretty amazing that a couple of years ago they did release a herd, and they are on the way to making this happen in many ways faster than I think a lot of people thought. There are also practical applications. So or implications of listing. So what happens if bison cross into Alberta, where they don't have any legal designation? They're in the same sort of category as skunks or as rats. What happens is they could get shot by pretty much anyone without any repercussions. Parks Canada, when a couple of bison from Blackfeet Nation got up across the border, Parks Canada intervened before that could happen and rounded them up, actually darted them from a helicopter and brought them back. And so it turned into a pretty big thing because they just don't have any protections in Alberta. So that matters for the actual animals and how they're managed. And then what happens when they cross park boundaries? So Glacier National Park talks about this. If bison come across from the reservation, are they wildlife or are they trespass cattle? It depends on, or trespass livestock. Depends on if they're considered domestic or wild. Because the tribe considers them wildlife, the park considers them wildlife. So there's a kind of jurisdictional alignment there that allows for bison to cross as wildlife in that landscape. But that doesn't apply in a lot of other cases. So when they cross outside of Yellowstone, for instance, they're considered a species in need of disease management and subject to the Department of Livestock's jurisdiction. So these sort of what seem to be semantic definitions end up having pretty significant practical consequences. Okay, so the last thing I want to touch on is sort of how could we manage bison for conditions of abundance and connectivity instead of the conditions of scarcity that we've been managing them for the last 150 years. There are a lot of different tools that people are already using to try to address these challenges and to try to think about making space for bison on larger landscapes. I won't go through all of these, but we can come back to the slide if people want to chat about particular ones. There are some interesting, I guess I'll highlight a couple. One of the things that people really emphasized was the importance of being creative. There are a lot of creative strategies out there. Lease swapping and safe passage leases or managed migration. Could you just, if you have parcels where bison aren't, where there's private property and bison aren't able to just cross freely, could you seasonally move them back and forth? What values could that also offer for the people who get to be involved in those efforts? A lot of folks talk about cultural burning as a way to manage bison movement and particularly to potentially draw them away from conflict areas. There are a lot of different economic measures that have shown to be useful when it comes to reducing damage or mitigating damage and improving tolerance. And then I think these sort of collaborative decision-making bodies are one of the most important ones. Another tool, of course, is taking this to court. And there have been, bison have been in court a lot of times over the last couple of decades. I think there are multiple opinions on that, absolutely. And I think those court cases have yielded really important advances in the ability for recognition of bison as wildlife. They've also entrenched a lot of political hostility. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Hunting, I think, is one of the most interesting tools that can be used to try to manage bison effectively. As mentioned with elk, there is a strong hunting lobby associated with elk that is part of why elk get to roam freely the way they do. And so potentially being able to cultivate more abundant populations that could be hunted could help support public acceptance and tolerance for wildlife, particularly along certain parts of the political spectrum. And then hunting is also a really useful tool to be able to manage movement. This is also a double-edged sword. What we're seeing in Yellowstone is that bison are starting to not really want to leave the northern boundary quite as much because they are experiencing high hunting pressure there. So this paper, which I worked on with some folks up in some Blackfeet collaborators and Libby, as well as Bruce Maxwell in Land Resources, is, I think, a slightly provocative paper about trying to whether there could be circumstances where it would make sense to have tribal hunting in the national parks. This is something that's super controversial in Yellowstone. It's not very controversial in Glacier, actually. And so I'm happy to chat about this more, but I don't want to, I want to have time for questions. So, like I mentioned, the IBMP process has actually, despite the fact that right now it is a bit stuck, it has actually achieved a lot of movement on the management of bison over the last couple of decades. There have been no cases of brucellosis transmitted to cows, so it has achieved the aim of not having bison transmit brucellosis to cattle. There have been significant kind of coexistence efforts happening around this. The treaty hunt around the park is controversial, but it has been incredibly powerful for expressing sovereignty, for exercising sovereignty. It's been really important as a population management tool. The Bison Conservation and Transfer Program now sees live bison leaving the park, going to quarantine in Fort Peck, and being sent out to tribes around the country to restore bison across the country, and I think even recently up in Canada. So we are, for the first time in a long time, seeing bison leave the park alive. And then the tolerance zones weren't, I mean, 2 decades ago, there was no tolerance for bison outside of Yellowstone. So even though this has been a difficult political process and it does seem to be a bit stuck at the moment, it has been pretty successful. And I think it's interesting to note why and how that's occurred. And then this is sort of a lesson from the INI initiative work. They've done incredible work to try to reconnect people with buffalo, to try to rebuild a relationship with buffalo, not only as sort of wildlife that are apart and far away, but as members of the community, as beings that they have kinship with, and to try to figure out how to balance a relationship with cows and buffalo together. Because as Latrice Tatsi points out, both are culturally important in our lives now. And she talked about how significant it is that her kids grew up with buffalo. She didn't grow up with buffalo, but her kids did. And most kids who go through the school system in Browning get to spend time with bison on the landscape. They get to see harvests. They get to go see the babies. And that is creating, as Blackfoot scholar Leroy Little Bear would say, this sort of buffalo consciousness that is genuinely emerging in this context. And I think that's something that very much could be applied elsewhere. The last point I'll mention is that, and I think this is really the trickiest aspect of this challenge, is how do we bridge political divides? If we're making progress on recognition of bison as wildlife via court cases, that can be really difficult in that it creates a political wedge in addition to maybe securing protections. Are there ways to try to build support across political divides? One of the strategies that I think might be most promising and that we see some success with around Waterton Lakes National Park, around Glacier National Park, is very local focused efforts to try to build sort of a relational buffer. If the people who are directly exposed to bison on the landscape are not that concerned about it, it takes the wind out of the sails of an argument by the state government, for instance, that we're standing up for, the ranchers who are being affected. If those ranchers who are being affected are not actually being heavily affected, if their challenges and concerns and impacts are being addressed effectively, that can potentially, and is starting to in some places, create some space for a less politicized conversation around bison and potentially other species as well. We're seeing that, up in the Blackfeet context, there is only a very, very small portion of space where there is intolerance towards bison right around the reintroduction area. That's a success. That's a result of relationship building. That's a result of people like the Blackfeet Fish and Wildlife Techs going out and helping fix people's fences, spending time, talking to people on the phone, showing up, being accessible. And that kind of work does make strides. Okay, so these questions are still very much active. This is a paper I would really like to write, but I haven't written yet. So I would be very interested in feedback and thoughts on what aspects of this are interesting and useful. I am in the process of continuing this Restoring Coexistence project. I've, so far conducted some interviews lots of interviews with livestock producers up in the Blackfeet Nation, fewer out in eastern Montana, and a handful around Yellowstone. So trying to build out the geographic representation of this interview data, doing that with Johnny Spotted Eagle in my lab. As I mentioned, some document analysis work on the IDMP documents. There is a treasure trove of material that we can dig through to try to understand patterns and trends. And then, as always, trying to think about how to collaborate with community partners in this kind of academic work in ways that are useful and productive. I'm very interested in extending some of these questions to other reintroduced species. And my grad student, Sophie Wilder, is working on that with wolves. And then also interested in and starting to work with colleagues across the US and Canada on a kind of larger scale synthesis of the social dimensions of bison conservation. So moving outside Montana. If you're interested in having conversations about any of these or other things that I brought up in the talk, please reach out. I would love to hear from you, and thank you very much. Thanks for listening.